Okay, Helen?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the planning group from Dún Laoghaire and Belfast South Methodist Churches, a very warm welcome to this concluding seminar in our series of Thinking Aloud. Wherever you're joining from, we're delighted to have you with us. And it's also very good to have with us the President of the Methodist Church in Ireland, the Reverend Dr. Sar Yambasu. We're glad that you can join us tonight as well. Our title for this evening is Looking to the Future for the Whole of Europe. And little did we realise when we were deciding on the titles what was about to unfold and how timely this topic would turn out to be. Mary Cross, who is a member of our planning group from Dún Laoghaire Methodist and a former Irish diplomat, is joining us from London. And Mary is going to share her thoughts and vision this evening. So Mary is going to speak for 15 minutes, after which we will break into discussion groups for about 20 minutes. Mary will then speak for another 15 minutes, after which we will have a plenary. We're very grateful, as always, to the Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster and Dr. Fergus O'Farrell for sharing their thoughts and expertise. And Fergus is going to chair the plenary, and Johnson will bring our evening and indeed our whole series to a close. So Mary, you're very welcome from London, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us for the last talk in the series, Looking to the Future. I'm following two previous presenters, Johnston McMaster and our president, Reverend Sar Yambasu, which, as you will judge, is a very difficult task. It's a very tough ask. As Helen said, when the subjects for this series of talks were proposed, we had no indication of the terrible events that were about to take place in Europe. The series was designed to look at the challenges that face us in today's world. There were cries of lament and cries for justice incorporated, but basically it was intended to look forward to the hopes and possibilities incorporating the European continent, embracing the EU and the UK, and looking forward to a future of cooperation and development. Now, the old order uncertainties are smashed by events, by the totally unprovoked attack by Russia on a sovereign independent state, Ukraine. And in the light of these circumstances, I have been asked to talk in two parts, to concentrate on the first part on understanding the war in Ukraine, the effect on Europe and internationally. And the second part I will consider the other challenges, but also the possibilities that face us in Europe at this time. Just to mention that my friends in the North were very fulsome in giving my CV, but just one, because it's relevant this evening, that I was accredited for 4 years to Ukraine as Irish representative. We were based in Prague, but every 3 or 4 months I went for 4 years to Ukraine, got to know the country well, and it's a great grief to me to see what's happening. Ukraine, interestingly, means the corner, the edge, the corner or most distant part of the Russian Empire, which is the same as Ireland, the most distant part of the EU. And it was the cradle of civilization for the Russian and Slavic empires. It was briefly independent after the First World War, but then incorporated into the Soviet Union as one of the semi-autonomous republics. However, it has always been more than semi-autonomous. It had its own seat, for example, when I was at the UN, as had Georgia and Belarusia. But when the Soviet Union started to disintegrate under Gorbachev, because the economy began to crumble under the weight of the communist system, Gorbachev's solution was to give the republics more autonomy. He never intended, interestingly enough, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, However, the republics took the autonomy and more when they realized the weakness of the whole system after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Ukraine declared independence with Georgia and Belarus in August 1991. And interestingly, a referendum supporting this was approved by 92% of Ukrainians, including those in Crimea and in the east of the country. While we thought the 90s were peaceful, they were not actually. There was a vicious war on the Balkans, and of course there were long drawn out efforts to conclude a peace agreement in Northern Ireland. But the war in the Balkans, and I mention it because it set the seeds for the present situation in Ukraine. The NATO intervened to end this war by bombing the Serb forces. The Russians and the Serbs were allies, and they never forgot the action by NATO. Not sanctioned by the UN, it couldn't have been. And since Putin came to power in 2000, a very long time ago, 22 years apart from the year he stood back, in 4 years he stood back, he has been obsessed by the humiliation of losing the Soviet Union and the perceived rebuff by the US to creating a new security architecture in Europe, and the reduction in the political and economic status of the Russian state. There are, of course, indeed some questions that we in Western Europe can ask ourselves, whether we handled the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War well. We were obviously the victors, but I think history will show we could have treated those countries that disintegrated, including particularly Russia, more deftly. We could have worked out a better foreign policy rather than winner takes all. There was a proposal by Putin for a security architecture in Europe. We could have assisted them economically. The country was effectively broke. And indeed, Putin in 9/11 had a very generous response to the US. However, that did not happen. And in addition to pour fuel on the fire, George Bush did, not a formal agreement, but he did promise Ukraine and Georgia that they would become NATO members. So since Putin, fuming and disenchanted, has built up a Russian army, investing hugely in men, equipment and forces as the state became wealthy on the back of oil and gas, the obsession grew on the back of this increase in power, and he took over Crimea in 2014. And apart from sanctions that the West imposed, there was no major pushback. Neither was there against the Russian-backed separatists in the east, where there have been over 8,000 Ukrainian deaths. And meantime, to extend his power, he went to Syria and wreaked unimaginable devastation and death, and shifting the balance of power in favor of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who is still in place. And still we continued in the West to buy Russian oil and gas and trade in every conceivable type of goods. Europe, of course, is now 30% dependent on Russian oil and gas. Germany is 40%. And the Eastern European countries, Bulgaria and Romania, are 80 to 90% dependent on Russian oil and gas. But Putin's paranoia grew and obsession through the COVID. And he was watching the US also through the Trump presidency and the deep fissures in US society, as well as the very botched exit from Afghanistan. And in Europe, he was also watching the discord with Hungary and Poland and the rule of law threats that the EU imposed on Poland. So having consolidated quite recently Russian and Chinese relationships, where he got fulsome support from China, he was then ready to invade Ukraine and claim his legacy of reunification with the motherland. One aspect that is of significant interest is the role of the Orthodox churches in both countries. There have been disputes for years, struggles between the Ukrainian and the Russian churches with strong political and nationalistic overtones. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church sought independence from Moscow and appealed to the Patriarch in Constantinople. And in 2018-19, the Patriarch George granted the Ukrainian Church independence, to considerable surprise. This utterly infuriated Putin, who, though an atheist, saw this as rebellion in an area which is of huge importance to the majority of Russians. Putin characterized the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in a recent essay as an attack on the spiritual unity of the Russian and UK people. Many felt that this may indeed have been the last straw as far as Putin was concerned. The Russian Orthodox Church broke off relations with Constantinople, and now the Russian Church, following the war, has been expelled from the Council of Churches. So what has been the response of the international community? Military response has been ruled out of the calculation, in that it could lead to the Third World War. The sheer unpredictability of Putin makes that possible. He possesses nuclear weapons. He has no compunction and no care for human life. Swathes and huge numbers of deaths don't mean anything in pursuit of his aim. Short of that, however, the united response of the UK and the EU and other democracies, except sadly, actually, India and South Africa, have been very positive. Local disputes have been put aside in Europe to supply Ukraine with military equipment, economic and humanitarian assistance, and a massive response to sanctions to exert pressure on Russia. The outpouring of support from governments, the welcoming of Ukrainians fleeing war, and the money provided from humanitarian assistance has been astounding. So the international implications of the war will, of course, be enormous and will be lasting. The fault line between the US, Russia, and China has deepened, with implications for trade, finance, and economics. And I think it's true to say that globalization as we know it in trade and services is broken. One major effect of the invasion, of course, will be a significant increase in military spending in all European states and a much more militarized Europe. That has been the commitment. Germany has reversed its up to now pacifist policy to commit to spending 100 billion on military equipment for its armed forces and providing military equipment to Ukraine. In Ireland, both the Taoiseach and Minister Coveney, who is Minister for Defence and Foreign Affairs, has said that Ireland is not ethically, morally, or politically neutral, and we need a new conversation encompassing military neutrality and what it involves. The Taoiseach has said we must reflect on old approaches and how this will fit for us for the 20th century security, both at home and abroad. The Russian exercises, of course, in January, which were initially scheduled for to be within our exclusive economic zone, show that we are vulnerable and that we could be used to attack our neighbours and also our considerable industrial interests between the US and Ireland. So it is clear that we all have to reach into our reserves of resilience and our pockets to help governments deal with what is to come, with high prices, with shortages. We will have to help those hardest hit and support what measures will be put in place in this regard and reach out ourselves where we see need. There is so much at stake for us, not in the act of war, but in the lives of people, our people. And as I mentioned, even as this terrible war continues, divisions and differences within Europe have been overcome. And we have to ask the question, would we ourselves harness this goodwill and the lessons it has taught us for the greater good in our own situation, North and South, and between Britain and Ireland? So with this short introduction to the situation in Ukraine, just to conclude, what could we see for the future in terms of the war ending? There are really three options. The war continues for months, a stalemate, but terrible destruction. There may be some peace agreements, but that's not a great prospect. Or Putin is overthrown, and that's even less of a prospect given the structure of the Russian political scene. So I leave it where it is, with the horrible destruction and loss of life in Ukraine, and leave the discussion open to see what people think and what we might do ourselves. Thank you, Helen.
So over to you, Mary. I keep everybody on mute until Mary has finished.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. And as mentioned, the second part, we had the tragedy of Ukraine, and the second part of the discussion, really, I thought we'd concentrate on the other challenges that are facing us in Europe, and, you know, I mean the wider Europe, UK, EU, and even, you know, other countries beyond that. One of the first things that struck me when I started to think about what are the greatest challenges facing us at the moment was democracy and the preservation of democracy, and how important it is, and how, you know, it could slip away without us seeing it or being aware of it. The threats from right-wing nationalists are growing, from nationalists, even if they're not nice. And one can see in many places in Europe, with reductions of civil rights being curtailed, and where we've seen press and social and legal freedoms being curtailed. And radical and anarchists very easily use legitimate protests to disrupt what are organized and legitimate demonstrations, turning them into battlegrounds. There's fake news and hybrid attacks are huge challenges coming over our screens. Something else too is the treatment of politicians discourages right-thinking people from entering politics, and many are leaving it because the floor is then left to the loudest and most populists, where emotion trumps reasoned debate. And this is a real danger to our democratic systems. And we should be aware of the difficulties that attacks, both verbal and physical, in some cases are visited on public figures, and push ourselves out of our comfort zone, I think, to resist it where we can and where we notice it. One of the other major problems for Europe, of course, is, as well as Ukraine, which is in a separate case at the moment, is continued instability on Europe's borders. Regional conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa continue to drive and increase migration. And this is a challenge for all of the governments in the EU and in the UK. We've seen huge challenges, huge numbers coming, but it's also a challenge, of course, for us as individuals. We've seen people fleeing from war, but there will also, of course, be huge swathes of what we call economic migrants from Africa and Asia, Eastern Europe. And how do we develop a humane policy that will not run the risk of civil unrest that can be used also by radical groups and radical nationalists? We saw, I suppose you could say, a milder version of it, but an anti-migrant rhetoric in the case of the Brexit debate. Another major challenge for us, of course, is climate change. And the means to counter climate change and to keep global warming to 1.5%, this poses huge challenges for all of Europe, for the world, but we're focusing on Europe. It's proving very difficult to engage populations in this fight when it's not an immediate challenge, such as floods or earthquake on our own doorstep. And this has been made much more difficult by the war, with there's certain backslidings on getting rid of fossil fuels. There's a halt now to the thought of Russian gas and Russian oil with sanctions, and that maybe now is not the time to move ahead quickly with fossil fuels. The green economy has been developing very well. The EU in particular had devoted huge amounts of money to the green economy, and the many upsides that there would be with jobs in the green economy. But we do need to get people to seriously engage and commit to accept sacrifices if we are to develop opposition to climate change and to get the policies that are necessary. There are many positives in this area, as I say, with the jobs. But we need a stark message, and I think we need a Christian message on behalf of poorer communities that are more affected every year. The environment and all of God's kingdom, which we are committed to protect, we have to exercise ourselves, and I hope that we can get a stronger message out on the need for action in this area. I have a couple of other challenges, not in any particular order, but one I have been very conscious of in working in relation in the military and the Defence Forces report recently is cyber. It's one of the big challenges for Europe, is cyber security. And we can see this in our own systems on a daily basis that come down to us as individuals for scams and attempted frauds. The HSE cyber attack last year cost the government over 120 million to repair. And governments and the EU are working to stay ahead of the hackers, but it's a struggle in security, financial and malevolent influencing material. The influencing in the cyber area of elections, for example, the US election, the French election, and a host of other countries where there's been significant influence exerted through the use of cyber. And we have to be on our guard and support governments who are trying to get capacity and expertise in this area. I just want to mention another challenge that I think we have in our midst, and it's in relation to education. This, of course, is a challenge for all of Europe. There is a range of different systems of education throughout Europe. And the challenge for all countries, of course, is to provide education and training which can satisfy the individual and satisfy the needs of government and industry, which is quite a balancing act. We have to match skills to opportunities and encourage students to undertake courses which are fulfilling for them, but do not put them under the pressure of others' expectations. But this is such a vital area for well-being for our people that it requires an enormous amount of in-depth thinking and strategic planning. And I would put this as one of the major elements for governments on which to concentrate. Another, of course, is social media. We have spoken of cyber, but its sister is social media, which now influences our lives in hugely significant ways. Huge numbers have been found fulfilling work in these areas, and have developed brilliant innovations, not least in our own country, which is an outstanding example of where young people have been so innovative in this area. But we have to accept the downsides. At a superficial level, there is a lack of human interaction for many young people. They get out of the habit of networking at a personal level, of reaching out for information, to cultivate real friendships. More seriously, the isolation, but also the negative power of social media can and does lead to despair and suicide. And we have to find ways to counteract these negative efforts in the schools, but in particular in our homes. And I have to accept this is not easy, given the secrecy of the medium. but confidence must be built up for the young and indeed in the not so young people. For all of these challenges, we have to work out a system for dealing with them. But one of the major challenges is the issue of the widening gap between rich and poor, between the haves and the have-nots. And it's hard to believe that during COVID that this gap has widened. And governments are trying to cope with this, but the scale is increasing every day, and the social unrest that this is likely to lead to, the challenges for government to level up, as it's particularly called in the UK, is a difficulty, and it requires huge financial input, which of course is now going to be very challenged with the limitation on the basics for people such as heating. Housing is another huge issue that governments are having to deal with, as well as everything else. But the gap between rich and poor can have huge consequences. If this continues to widen, we have a conscience to see that those at the lower end of the scale, in terms of low wages, low conditions, poor working conditions, that we make our voices heard, that this does not continue to a totally unsustainable degree. For all of these challenges, one of the other main challenges is our consideration of the developing countries. They are dealing with the development. We have our World Development Aid, which has done so much good. But the war in Ukraine has had a huge impact on countries in Africa who depend greatly on Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian fertilizers, Russian grain. And the price of these has risen so incredibly that the countries in Africa in particular, and also other underdeveloped countries, will really struggle to put food on the table and to even maintain a low standard of living. So it's something I think we need to be very much conscious of, that we will see shortages, we may see difficulties, we may be paying for heating oil that's almost an unsustainable price, but that there are those who for whom it is life and death, and that cannot afford even the basics with the huge increases in prices. So that is basically a run through of the challenges that I see coming down the tracks. As I say, we don't want to be looking at the totally negative side. There are upsides, as I say, in the green economy. We can develop that, particularly in the island of Ireland. We have every opportunity to have jobs in the green economy, and they will be supported greatly from the European point of view. And I know that the British government is also developing their own energy sources. So for all of these challenges, which seem very weighty, I think we can call on our Christian faith. And in living our faith, I think we are called upon to help people in our communities and beyond, to care for creation and for all of God's gifts, and to challenge injustice. It can be difficult to live these three challenges, But if we can encompass all of the areas that I have outlined and make our personal contribution. It's not easy. For example, challenging injustice is very seldom welcomed in the situations I have outlined. But I suppose at the end of the day, we should take comfort from the fact that the real satisfaction in an individual life is in contributing to the well-being of others. So let me finish on that hopefully positive note. Thank you, Helen.